Today, we have Lys Lin on the show, who is a mental health therapist, and she is the first person to move from Taiwan from her family to the U.S., which was 11 years ago. She came here as an international student in the late 20s and decided to stay for career opportunities and also for love. Yay, we love love here on the podcast. So we're excited to talk with her about her experiences with belonging as an Asian American. So let's get into it today with Lys. Hey everyone, we have with us today a brilliant therapist, friend of mine that I'm really excited for this conversation and for all of you to hear from. One of my favorite people that I've met just a couple of years ago, Lys Lin. And here we go into this conversation that we have wanted to talk about on this podcast for a long time together. We've talked about it for a while now. And that is belonging while identifying as Asian American, something that is growing in our country in terms of population, but also in terms of conversation that we need to have about what it means to belong with this identity that is oftentimes considered a model minority, but also the quiet minority that kind of stays to yourself and show up and work hard and all these stereotypes that we're going to dig into. And so oftentimes there's not voice to the experiences of what it means to be Asian American, particularly in today's society. But so there's this long history of what that means. And I couldn't be more excited to have this conversation with you about this topic, Lys. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for all the kind words. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me. And then I can feel the weight already, like me representing a population that is usually pretty quiet.
Mm-hmm. When you say you feel the weight, tell us about that.
So there is that identity, like Asian American identity here coming in. I am an Asian immigrant. Technically, I'm not a citizen yet. It's in the process. So that means I don't, for a majority of my life here in the US, or even up to like my professional life as a therapist here, I don't really entirely feel like I can speak for the Asian American, the Asian population who are born and raised here and what it is like for them, because I'm only here for like 11 years. And for the first couple of years, I'm very naive and I don't think myself as a person of color until later on that I started grappling on that. Oh, this is how people look at me. And I started opening my eyes and ears about like, if I belong to this community, what was that experience like for me?
So when you say you didn't see yourself as a person of color, I'm very curious about that. What did a person of color in your mind look like?
Yeah, that would go all the way back to, because I grew up in Taiwan, born, raised, grow up in Taiwan till like adulthood. So that means person of color in my mind is, I would say probably more black and brown.
Mm-hmm.
So that you recognize them as people of color and then like their darker skin. But at the same time, you also associate because of all the media portray like I can get in Taiwan. I will feel like if I claim to be people of color, I'm taking up resources that it's not designed for me. I think that mentality is there. So the first encounter of that term, it was 2013. It was my first grad school orientation summer. Everybody's like so excited. And then and then we went to all different like orientation. And then I went to the one with international students. And then there's a new friend of mine. She is Korean American, born and raised here. She said, "Hey, Lys, there's that student of color orientation later in this afternoon. Are you going with me?" And you want to go together? Basically, she invited me to go with her. And I was like, what? I am not a student of color. And she's like, yes, you are, girl. Yes, you are. That forever changed the way I see myself and how I understand how people see me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting too, to, at least to hear you say that, because it's like the reason that you shared that you didn't see yourself as a person of color was because you feel like you're taking up someone else's space.
Mhm.
And that seems to
Yes.
align with what I was just initially saying in terms of
Yeah.
not just the stereotype, but the expectation oftentimes that might be unconscious, but an unconscious
Yeah.
societal expectation is that if you're Asian identifying, if you're Asian
Yeah.
American, if you look Asian American, then you stay
Mhm.
quiet. And even so, when we talk about that, we're talking about a very specific part of the Asian community, specifically East
Yes.
Asian, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Because
right.
now, as we say Asian American, or when we speak to folks who are Asian identifying, now it's a larger umbrella term that includes people who are South Asian, people who are East Asian, people who are Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders. In the past, though, that wasn't the case. And I still think that many people, when they hear the term Asian or Asian American, they're specifically thinking people who are East Asian, people from mainland
Yes.
China, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from Japan, from Korea, for example, Vietnam, and of course, many other countries. And so many other countries are left out, but there's so much diversity now within the Asian community
Yeah.
that is still not
Yeah.
necessarily acknowledged or comes to mind right away.
Yes. That is so correct. That I think I was as the how was it iconic face of Asian American. Like I think my face. You look at me and immediately jump into that association, the stereotype of like what Asian American is like. Um, and for me, it's having so many people lumped together, for me, that creates a sense of belonging for sure. That, oh, I feel closer to the Indian neighbors that in our area. I will feel closer. I gravitate towards them because I feel like we're in the same area. Like we grow up in the same area of the world. Right?
Mhm.
We understand something. And as a Buddhist, I also gravitate towards them, even though they might not even be Buddhist themselves. I feel like, oh yeah,
Mhm.
we're closer in that way. Culturally, we're so diverse. If I'm not in the US, if I am in Taiwan, sitting at home, um, Vietnam, Thailand, India feels like, wow, this beautiful countries that I should visit one day. But here, I feel like, oh, yeah, we belong. Like, we should go to a Thai restaurant. If I got a chance, I'm going to a Vietnamese restaurant. Like, if as if they are part of me too. So I think psychologically, it is working out for me. But I also know if we're coming down to that resources piece, um, again, that having this umbrella term is actually we're taking out resources for the community that really needs it. Because I am the typical stereotype of the Asian immigrants. I'm an international student. I I'm not from a wealthy family, but you can probably assume my family is doing okay, or I
Yes.
won't be here. The stereotype of like Asian American or Asian students coming in, um, highly achieved, come with resources. We will become the H-1B holders and contribute to this country and like financially that in that way. But there are also umbrella term Asian countries, Asian people coming into this country as refugees because of natural disasters, because there's no way they can continue living in their country. There are so many different ways that people come into this country, and our narrative as the typical East Asian narrative, yeah, we might take up resources.
So you've had to kind of shift your thinking in terms of thinking that you're taking up resources to saying, I'm entitled to some resources.
In a way, I feel like I am trying to use my identity or my voice to kind of bring in attention, awareness, or resources towards our direction. Like, oh, come towards us. And within this us, we know I don't represent all. And then I am becoming highly, highly aware that there are people who actually need it. And how do we balance that narrative? It becomes like something I think about quite often. Yeah, because there will be, if we're using that, I think the census, something comes into that. I think I got this idea over like very recently, and they are talking about how the diversity within AAPI, or even you combine the NH into the AAPI altogether, we're actually taking away resources from the NH and then the PI. We're
I
not,
see.
and that is not helpful for them. Yeah.
Okay. So you're saying
Mhm.
because of
Yeah.
lumping together these very different
Mhm.
groups of people, when you're saying
Yeah.
NH, you're talking about Native Hawaiians and PI Pacific
Yes.
Islanders. And
Yes.
because of that, there are different needs that are there. And
Yes.
feeling that one group is getting resources that other people could use instead of separating them and maybe separating NH and PI. Is that
Mhm.
correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
That's right.
because the
Yeah.
needs aren't the
Yeah.
same. That makes so much sense. And so by not really recognizing the diversity and within amongst a group of people, amongst different groups of people, that's actually creating more harm.
Yes. Like for me, when I'm on the majority side, I get the benefit of like, oh, I'm feeling like I belong to a greater community. But if you're on the minority side of this lump, you, there isn't that much representation. If you're looking average income, their end of the story got kind of washed off, and their end of that narrative of like the true strugglings, and because of the dominant East Asian stereotype, like in schools, in education system, they might, when they check the box of Asian or AAPI in the application, that put them in a very different kind of box. And then we are kind of forced to compete within those groups. And that is not like the most, yeah, that's what I was like, nah, that's, when it becomes something that I'm aware of, I've become like, what are some of the things I can do? What are some of the things what is my stance here, right?
And so there's this almost like guilt to belonging
Mhm.
to a certain community
Yes.
in the way that it's
Yes.
been defined for you that you didn't ask for.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. And that's why it's important to have this conversation because I'm
Yeah.
willing to bet that, like myself, many of us did not have that understanding, and so that perspective really matters. And by the way, none of us can be representative for an entire group of people. Same way I
Yeah.
cannot speak for all people who are Middle Eastern and not even all people who are Egyptian or North African.
Yeah.
I can't do that.
Yeah.
Just like I can't speak for all people who are, who identify as women or Southerners.
Mhm.
We all have very
Yeah.
diverse experiences. This conversation is really about the perspectives that you've had and the lived experiences that you've had, but also your clinical expertise. Lys, is something
Mhm.
that we're really interested to hear more about
Yeah.
because I know for a fact you work at our practice at North Counseling
Yes.
and you have so many people requesting to see you. And by the way, your clients stay with you, they love you. And so many people request to see you for many reasons. First of all, you speak Mandarin fluently, and not many therapists do. And so that's very helpful. So we're glad to see that there is some destigmatizing happening within the Asian community in terms of seeking mental health, although, of course, it's still ongoing efforts to break those stigmas down. But as soon as you were on the website, boom, all these people came in wanting to see you. When I say folks wanting to come see you, I mean specifically people who are either bicultural or who identify as Asian. And I'm curious to hear from you. What are some of the ongoing themes that you notice amongst your clients who are Asian identifying or possibly Asian American identifying? And those experiences might be very different, by the way, because coming from a more recent immigrant background is different
Yeah.
than being maybe 2 or 3 generations here.
one common theme I notice across the board is probably this not good enough kind of mentality, that that or complicated relationship with their parents. Doesn't matter if it's people who are in contact with me, it's definitely at least one foot in the US culture, if it's not completely in this culture. And you start seeing the generational gap. Like, oh, my parents back home, they think and behave very differently than how I believe to be true here. I'm exposed to US culture, and now I feel like I need to pursue personal, freedom, personal achievement, or I would rather lay back a little bit and then value my own well-being. And then like that conflict in terms of like values with their
Mhm.
parents, or you're looking at second generation and beyond, and they are struggling with communicating with their first generation immigrant parents. I have clients who don't even speak the same language with their parents. Parents are not fluent in English. The child is. And but the child doesn't really speak. They understand, but they don't speak fluently of the the parents' language, whether it's Mandarin, Vietnamese, or Korean. Um, that's the one that I run into. And for me, it was just like there's so much loss in there. And I was like, how do you know your parents completely without this language piece? That a lot
Mhm.
of communication comes down to nonverbal or very limited. And then there's the communication, understanding the connection in depth. That I'm not questioning like, oh, if you don't use verbal, then there's no in depth. Like, but it's definitely limited and then make you feel like you cannot grapple like what your parents are experiencing completely, or you feels like your parents don't really understand you completely. And the way I'm saying it, I don't want to make it sound like I'm blaming what happened about the language not being passed down. I think it's when it's immigrant, it's survival. You want your kids to survive. And academic success is one of the biggest definition of surviving and then thriving in any places for a nation person.
Yeah.
We seek
Yeah.
out academic success. That's like big career, right? You want that trajectory. So if learning your first language is deemed as a distraction from your school, the regular schooling, then yeah, that I probably will become like second thoughts very easily.
And it makes a lot of sense why it is that parents are not teaching the children their language, even though, of course, in retrospect, oh my gosh, it'd be so nice if I could speak, my parents'
Yeah.
native language and what feels like should be your native language, but there's a disconnect there, right? But at the time, it could be really challenging for parents. I think you might know this. I did a study of 314 individuals, and they were born in the US and they had at least one parent that immigrated to the US. And I was looking at how fragmented their bicultural identities were. So let's say you mentioned someone who's Korean American, for example. So how fragmented or how integrated are their Korean aspect of identity and their American aspect of identity? And so the more integrated they are, meaning the more hyphenated identity, being Korean American, this could be for any country, by the way, then the better mental health outcomes people tend to have. So that is just a statistic that's out there. Well, that's not the statistic. That is information that's out there. You can find that in many studies. What I wanted to know in my study was what leads to higher levels of integration? What is a predictor of higher levels of integration? And there were a few things. One of them was sense of belonging. So now, I study belonging. But the other one that I don't talk about as much was actually the proficiency in their parents' native language. And so the more
Wow.
proficient someone is in their parents' native language, the more integrated their identities are, meaning that there's less code switching, less feeling like I can only be Korean in this space, and I can only be American in this space, but more I could be Korean American in the example that we used. And that was really important because people who do not speak their parents' native language tend to have more cultural homelessness, meaning that they feel more isolation here in this country and more isolation in their parents' country. And so, where do we feel like we belong? And so, when we are able to speak the same language as one another, we have the ability to create stronger emotional bonds. And they've looked at these studies between specifically mother and child. There might be others out there, but the ones that I've read have been between mother and child. And that when they speak different languages and or they're speaking in something that's their second or third language, not their primary language, it's harder for them to show emotion or to relay emotion in the same ways, thereby making it more challenging to create a strong of an emotional bond. So it makes sense to me what you're sharing about your clients that if their primary languages are different than their parents, then there's kind of a disconnect that tends to happen.
Yes, that's right. And then I want to add another piece here is that internalized racism and how learning your mother's language is actually discouraged or how it's like disregarded when you're coming from that part of the world. When you come into the USA, you're like, I wanted to belong. I wanted to belong here. I want my kids to belong here. And we are all giving our kids English names, right? Like that. We're giving them extra like names that doesn't sound like our language. We're giving them like white sounding or more typical American names. We kind of like discard some things along the way to pursue the sense of like I want to belong to this new country, new culture. Um, because when I imagine if it's a European descendant and European immigrant coming into the US, I have coworkers from previous jobs. She really like she gravitates towards her mom who's from Germany, and she really like embrace on that in that identity and wanting to learn. And then she is fluent, and she would travel there all the time. And I think when you're looking at too like this completely white looking woman and this like maybe Chinese looking child, the way they grow up might be very different. Like how when you bring your food, your mom made to school, how is your classmates treating you?
Yeah.
Like when you watch like TV show like Fresh Off the Boat, it's a comedy, but it's there. Like you show up with a non-American food, you got mocked. So in this country, there's still that the hierarchy is still there. The racial hierarchy is there, and then inevitably the descendants, Asian descendants, they are constantly being like confronted with that. I almost question like, do we feel free to feel proud of our descendants? Even if we
Mm.
want to feel proud, is there a space for us to feel proud?
What would be the barriers to that?
I almost feel like it's the perceptions like, oh, first word that comes to me was like, are you acculturated enough? Are you assimilated enough? The perception of like, are you American enough? If you
Yes,
keep your mother tongue, if you keep your original name, if you keep your original food, the cultural beliefs, and you gravitate towards your family, you have this enmeshed, air quote, enmeshed relationship with your parents. These are all being questioned in this current society, and that's inevitably confronted like with the norm here.
and you're putting enmeshed in quotes as
Mhm.
if that is a perception that people might have when really it
Yeah.
might be that you're coming from a collectivist culture where we do things with our families in mind. That doesn't necessarily
Mhm.
mean that we're enmeshed.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right.
So it's really
Yeah.
about perception. Yeah. And so when we're talking about perception, I know you and I have had this conversation before about the different stereotypes that there are, kind of circling back to the beginning of the conversation and how these stereotypes are perpetuated, really introduced oftentimes and then perpetuated by pop culture, specifically like in movies and in TV shows, and how there are specific kind of characters that Asian looking actors will play. And so I'm curious just for you to share a little bit more about these very specific kind of characters that we see that don't seem to go outside of that oftentimes when we see Asian or Asian American portraying actors.
I feel like the Asian women stereotype are pretty well known, well discussed, but nobody's really paying attention to Asian male. And then I started looking at it and just realized that there are, in some studies, they kind of like conclude that there are four stereotypes that you will see among like Asian male in pop culture. The four stereotypes are so strong that I look everywhere. It's really hard to get out of this four stereotype. Number one is the Kung Fu master. Yes, it's right there. Mr. Miyagi, right? Like, it's right there. This one. Number two, you have the fresh off the boat immigrant. So you will see that that the person that lives upstairs from Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany, that is like a really funny looking with teeth, broken English, very fresh off the boat, international students in spaces that is like awkward. So that awkwardness is definitely being shown there. The third one is the smart psychic of the white person, a white hero. So you got the new Spider-Man movie that it's like, oh yeah, we're seeing Asian faces. We're getting Zendaya as the female lead, but the Asian is still like kind of like there's like a funny awkward-ish to it. But how come the Spider-Man is never like Asian? And then you will have the fourth type, the villain. There's so many movies that were the villain, like were the Korean, the Chinese, were the villain with like because our eyes, I think that racism about our eyes was so real that because you cannot really see our eyes, you are assuming that we're scheming of some sort. So these four stereotypes you look across all over the place. These four stereotypes were so hard for Asian male to get out of that stereotype. And I'm also wondering that it's like a very emasculate experience for them and also for Asian female as well. We're looking at our partner, we're looking at our male friends, our siblings, our kids, and thinking that is that how the world looking at them?
What we're seeing in media does impact how our brains are programmed. It's
Yes.
like no matter how hard we try, our brains are being programmed with what it is that we're putting in front of ourselves. And that's why
Mhm.
representation really does matter, because the
Mhm.
conscious mind cannot break all of those things down in the subconscious mind or in the unconscious mind, even. And so
Yeah.
if we go somewhere and we find ourselves kind of scared of someone that has a certain kind of look, even though we
Mhm.
don't consciously think of ourselves as racist, it's because that part of our brain, that fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain that is not conscious, has been programmed with imaging and with messaging. And that is,
Yes.
again, why representation matters. And I hope that people can listen to this podcast and at least begin to recognize the images that they're seeing and the roles that they're seeing in pop culture. Like, why is it that that this particular character is so easily falling into one of these four categories? Who is it that's producing these movies? What are we doing? What are we thinking as we're casting these roles? And as we have these images come to mind of like, oh, like let's say you're a casting director. Oh, we're going to have the villain. Why is it that this person, a person who's Asian American or even a Black man, right, would pop into mind? Someone that we deem untrustworthy. Why is that? Do we want to continue perpetuating those images? And most of us are not casting directors, but most of us are consumers on some level. And so we can decide what it is that we want to support. Yeah. But these same themes that you're seeing are these things that you're seeing reflected in your clinical sessions with folks as well in terms of um, kind of combating or having to face these types of challenges with stereotypes?
I just had a session this morning with Asian American female client that she talked about how she doesn't feel like she belongs in any social settings. Like
Right.
she feels like you going in, you need to be like almost like prepared to show up certain way. Like she had to mold herself in a way, not like people pleasing, but more like fitting into what is expected of her. And a lot of spaces, she's the only Asian there. She's the only one that shows up in that friend group. She's the only one in her workspace. And then a lot of times she feels like she's like holding on to that conversation. Like don't forget about us, that conversation. I got that sense from her as well, that she's trying to bring something in while we're in the South. It's very, to quote some of her comments, it's a very black and white dichotomy here.
Yeah. And then trying to figure out what parts of me are going to be accepted here, what will be embraced. And I have to hide certain things so that I'm actually not seen because
Mhm.
I'm scared that I won't be embraced. And
Yes.
that is a very challenging belonging negotiation to have to make
Mhm.
internally. All of this is happening internally. And uh, and so then, I know for so many people I've talked with, there's that, okay, what level or to what degree of self abandonment can I actually endure right now
Mhm.
in order to have a certain amount of acceptance to some degree? Because you can't fully be accepted if you're not fully showing yourself, right? The
Mhm.
degree to which you show yourself and allow yourself to be seen is the degree to which you are open to being embraced and celebrated. But in many spaces, that's not safe.
Mhm.
And so gauging for safety can be really challenging. And so for folks who are wanting to be allies of their Asian American peers, of their Asian or Asian identifying colleagues, for example, um, what are some things to keep in mind then? What are ways that we can create more belonging for folks
Mhm.
who are Asian identifying or Asian American identifying?
Mm. I love that question. Yeah, I feel like I'm still like also like trying to figure it out myself too. Like on the first reaction I have about that is actually to be curious. Like bring curiosity into the space and not feeling not jumping into defensive mode. If we're talking about an encounter with a person, with a for example, a white person, it doesn't mean we're talking about you. We're talking about an incident where we're experiencing. You don't have to feel responsible for our experience because if we're not talking about you, it's not. I feel like holding that space, bringing curiosity. I'm like, yeah. So what is it like for you? What makes you feel offended in this situation? Um, Getting to know a little bit about the very complicated internal processing we have to go through, that will be very helpful because my like me first generation immigrant experience very different from second third generation immigrant. And if you're biracial bicultural, that is all a whole lot. Do you pass as white or do you pass as Asian? Also very different. um and so bringing curiosity into that conversation when this person was talking about their experience. And then the other one is that I think there's almost like a pitfall or something, that people would resort to like food as culture, which is not entirely true. Yeah, we would use food as an example. And Asian cultures, we do bond over food. Mm, All the things happen, on a in the restaurant in my home country. Yeah, that for sure. But if you're a non-Asian person wanting to get to know Asian person asking them about their food, that is not the only thing about that culture that is there.
Yeah.
So like food is on the surface level. You wanted to go deeper and really looking at what's underneath that water level in this iceberg.
Isn't
Culture
it?
is an iceberg, and their home country, their home way of the values they hold in the culture, they're very, very intrinsic down there. And yeah, going to a Chinese restaurant might be a great way when I feel nostalgic, but it's not the only way that you are supposed to feel when you are connecting with me. Just,
Right.
yeah, it is part of it, but it's not all of
Right.
it. So by
Well, it's
doing that, it's
reductionist.
not, yeah, that's right. It's not, you cannot say, oh, I went to Chinese restaurant all the time. That's why I cannot be racist against Chinese. No, no, right?
Oh gosh.
Yeah. I I
No.
have clients who run into a situation that she married outside of the Asian culture, and then the husband is not white, but the husband was like, I marry a Chinese woman. How can I be racist? Yeah, you
Wow.
can. Yeah.
And I
Yes,
sat
you
next
can.
to one of the
Yeah.
most racist
Yeah.
people I've ever encountered in my life. And I was stuck on an airplane for 3 hours with him. And he was talking about how he
My
voted.
God.
And this was back in 2017, I believe. And he was talking about how he voted and how he can't be racist because his wife is Chinese. Literally exactly what you just said.
Oh yeah.
When 9/11 happened, I had three bosses at the time, and one was just really outwardly racist the day that it happened. And he's these
Mm.
GD Middle Easterners, blah, blah, blah. And here I am, literally standing right next to him, watching this horrific incident. I
Yeah.
was in my 20s, mid 20s at the time. And he looked at me and goes, oh, sorry, like that. And then a few days later,
Mm.
I said something to him about it. And he was like, how could you say that? My wife and I, we donate to a child in Africa every month. The hell? Is this an actual
Yeah.
conversation that I'm having with someone? So,
That's right.
yeah, whatever your
Yeah.
charities are, regardless of who you're married to, you can and do have biases because of the very reasons that we just mentioned earlier in terms of the messaging that we have. And I think the call to action is to be aware that you have them, whether you know what they are or not, and to have that spirit of curiosity, because curiosity is really about having a spirit of learning. And I love your response to that because I think that can usher us into so many deeper connections with people in general, regardless of our identities. And also because of the differences in our identities. I thank you for sharing that. I really, really do. This is just such a
Yeah.
great skill to
Thank
have
you.
that can bring us so much closer together in general, you know? So with that, I'm, you know, what I see is there's a book that came out more recently called Where I Belong: Healing Trauma and Embracing Asian American Identity, right? And in there, they share a statistic. I believe it says that almost 80% of Asian Americans reported in 2023 that they feel like they don't belong and feeling that they're not accepted in some way. That's a pretty startling statistic that's also not surprising. Um, I'm wondering about your own perception about that or your own personal experiences around that.
I am not surprised because I feel like we're still living every day, living in the stereotype of like the forever foreigner. Very randomly, people will strike a friendly conversation with me, starting with "Where are you from?" Like just in the past few years, like past few 1 week. And I was just minding my own business in a Costco, and somebody's like, "Where are you from?" And I was like,
Oh my.
I usually would answer, but I feel like for the past like few years of like training of like getting into this mindset of like advocacy. So I asked him like, why do you want to know? So I feel I'm very proud of
Mm,
myself for asking that. because I want to know like what's behind that. I think he's just like, he sees a Chinese looking face and he wants to feel like, oh, I think he married a Chinese, and then he feels like close or familiar with this kind of face.
Mm.
I don't blame him, but I feel like it's not the best question to just randomly ask. Yeah.
One of the things I've noticed with my Asian American clients is that there's this assumption that people have access to them. Like
Mm.
you just get access to me uninvited and even
Yeah.
unapologetically. Like there's this entitlement to have access to anything you want to know about me, or even
Yeah.
to, particularly for Asian women and Asian American women, to having access to their bodies, to having access to any information they want to have about this particular
Mhm.
person. And that is entitlement and arrogance
Mhm.
at
Yeah.
best, right?
Yeah, thank you for pointing it out. I don't think I have a word or a phrase to describe what that feeling is, but yes, that boundary crossing. Yes.
Yes. Yes. And the thing is that we don't have to belong to everyone. I think this is kind of counter to what we normally talk about, is that you get to decide who you belong to, and you don't have to belong to that person in Costco. You don't have to. You have agency over that, as we all do. So, Lys, what does belonging mean to you?
That's a great question. The first thing I was thinking about on that question was I want to feel like I am not responsible for other people's fragility, basically.
Mhm.
That I don't have to be I don't have to be apologetic about how my identity makes you feel. This is my reality, this is my truth. And I would want to belong to a space that when I show up, people know that, okay, there's boundary. And if I don't know, I will ask. I got curious. And if I cross the boundary, I apologize. Instead of me on this end trying to care for your feelings by molding myself. So that's the feeling that I get. Yeah. Thanks to my clients. They really helped me out on this one.
They
Yeah.
really do, don't they? The call to action
Yeah.
for whenever we're calling our clients to action, we're really doing it for ourselves also. And what I'm hearing from you is that belonging is bringing my identities forth unapologetically and
Yes.
without care necessarily, in terms of like, I
Yeah.
don't have to be careful about my
Hmm.
identities. It's not like I don't have to be careful with
Yeah.
the energy with which I'm showing up, but I don't have to be
Yeah.
careful about what my identities are.
That's right. Yeah. How I make you feel. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Lys. I really, really,
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your being here today and having this really important
Yeah.
conversation. And
Yeah.
you might have to come back on the show and give us another
Yeah.
round. This
Yes.
is really,
I
really
really
great.
do feel like once you open the door, it's like a lot more wants to come out. Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
Yeah.
That's what happens. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for being here. We love
Thank
you. We
you.
appreciate you.
Thank you so much. I'll see you around.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. All of the show notes and links can be found on my website at drmonanour.com. That's drmonanour.com. Throughout most episodes, you'll hear me referring to the belonging model that I developed, which is represented by a belonging life map that helps you explore areas in your life where you feel more connection and areas where you might feel more isolation. And you can get a free copy of your own belonging life map on my website. Again, that's drmonanour.com. If you like the Belonging Reimagined podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review. That can help more folks find us and keep more episodes coming. Until next time, I'm Dr. Mona. You're right where you belong.